situation, and we'll see it's a quadruple disaster. There's 4 things that happen. So we're gonna sort of wrap up plate tectonics, and this case study also has a lot of other stuff in it, like engineering, architecture, history, religion, geography. There's literature, economics, chemistry, civics, land use planning, poli-sci, disaster preparedness, philosophy. So really everything is rolled into this neat case study. So Lisbon, where are we geographically? There is Europe, as you can see, and expanding out from near Spain is Portugal. And then when we're looking at Portugal, we're looking at Lisbon. So there's Lisbon, the area. So start to have a feel geologically for what would happen if you brought a wave into this shallow bay, right? That would happen as a result of an earthquake. So that's where we are geographically. And what about tectonically? Global tectonic maps, and when we talk about the basics of tectonics, that have you believe that Lisbon is rather auspiciously located mid-plate, right? So there should be no problem with there having any tectonic-related disasters in Lisbon. But if we look closer, and if we look really deeply at the science, a closer look reveals a rather sinister picture here. So this is a fairly complicated diagram, but you can walk through it with me with these numbers. So what's happening is, number one, the North American and Eurasian plate are having this divergent boundary, which creates new crust in the mid-Atlantic, right? So we have a divergent boundary and magma's welling up. And then we have oceanic African lithosphere subducting northward under the Eurasian plate in the east. Remember, subduction is the place where you get the big earthquakes. But to the west, we have the colliding of the southern border of the Eurasian plate, and then the northern boundary of the African Apulian promontory. Don't worry, you don't have to remember all this, but I'm just trying to show you it's a hugely complicated tectonic picture that's moving north, and that's what's creating the Alps. And if that's not enough, the Arabian plate's also moving north, but it's exposed to a lot less resistance, and it's therefore faster, moving faster than the African plate. So we have a transform boundary, right? This one's moving faster than this one. And then we have 2 little microplates. They're labeled MP, 2 little microplates that are getting shoved westward by the Arabian plate, which is moving really quickly. And that manifests in significant movement that are accompanied by pretty strong earthquakes at the North Anatolian Fault. So this is the tectonic activity that gets all the attention, and the Iberian area has less. Again, you don't have to remember all this, just understand that it's a lot more complicated than we make it out to be. There's a lot going on. There's subduction zones, there's divergent boundaries, there's transform boundaries, and they're all happening at different rates. And when you have different rates, then you have the possibility for more movement. So moving even closer, there was a gentleman by the name of João Duarte. He's been studying the area for about 20 years, and 2 years ago he used seismic images, seafloor bathymetry, which is mapping the underwater sea fault, and discovered that there's also active thrust faults, which are when the material comes together and one block of rock drops or gets pushed upward relative to the other. That's a good situation for tsunami, right? And this is throughout a supposedly passive margin. So passively pulled along, nothing's going on. That's what we historically thought of was the case, but it's not. There's actually thrust faults. So the interesting thing about this is that this is a margin that was historically passive, nothing's going on, but it's now being reactivated. So let's think about that with regards to our country and the Real Foot Rift, right? It's starting to be reactivated. So there's a new convergent plate boundary that's forming. And this is interesting because if you look at convergent boundaries, you can never really figure out what's going on what has gone on through the past, because you're destroying one plate, right? So it's hard to figure out what happened here. So this is an embryonic, they call it, plate boundary. So you're looking at a convergent boundary that is just starting to move. And sorry, I'll put these other things out. The African plate's moving at about 4 millimeters per year to the west-northwest against Iberia. And at the same time, this flap of the African plate is sinking down into the mantle. So this is a new, tiny subduction zone, and we expect that over the next several million years, this kind of conveyor belt may roll outward toward the Atlantic and merge with the Iberian zone into a big trench. So again, that's geology that's a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but Tectonically, it has been very active, and it will continue to be active, maybe even more so, given this embryonic subduction zone. So bottom line, we have a lot of tectonics going on. We have all three of the plate boundaries in an area that maybe, at first glance, we shouldn't have this. Topographically, when you're looking at Lisbon, the city in Portugal, there are some high peaks, but overall it rises from about 0 to 300 meters, which is about 1,000 feet, from 15 kilometers to the peak. So the slope is really flat. So it's a fairly flat area. We would like this from a disaster's point of view. There's one peak there, but again, overall, it's really flat. We would like this from a disaster's point of view if we're talking about landslides, right? We like a flat area because you won't have downslope movement of material. However, when we're talking about water invading into a region, the area being flat is significant because you will potentially have massive flooding pretty far inland. So the point to this, the topography is that it's pretty flat. So looking at Lisbon, this is an old picture, obviously a drawing of Lisbon. Pre-earthquake Lisbon, really sort of from a cultural point of view, it was one of the world's most influential cities at the time. It was among the largest cities. It was among the wealthiest cities in Europe. The name was traced back to Phoenician times. It was called Alas Ubo, or safe harbor. So it was a thriving economy. And the economy, unfortunately, was based on colonizing South America and Africa, enslaving people, and exploiting their natural resources, including a gold rush in Brazil. And then they used the spoils to wage war on Spain, France, and Turkey. So it was a very wealthy colonial nation, and it was growing and growing. And they wanted to colonize as much of the known world as possible, which, as you know, has historically worked out well for countries, right? They were trying to build this massive empire. The people there were quite pious. It was populated with devout Catholics who feared repercussions from a God who was angry with them for sinning. And popular tales abounded in this region about the smiting of Portugal by impending disasters. And the tales were saying that the inhabitants were going to be left quaking and fearing for their lives. So everybody was afraid a little bit. They were living in this great time, but they were petrified of some impending doom. And there were three main players, and kind of another underdog and his wife, and then a very powerful prime minister, essentially. The first person is King Joseph I. He doesn't have much of a role despite him being the king. He succeeded the Portuguese throne in 1750. He was only 36 years old, and he didn't want anything to do with it. He wasn't sort of the ruling type, so he placed all of his power into the hands of Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, who was called the Marquess of Pombal. And in the whole history of Joseph's reign was really the history of the reign of the Pombal. He was just sort of did nothing. He declared his daughter, Maria Francesca, the heir to the throne, and then sort of checked out. When I die, she's going to be the heir. She's going to be the queen. And then they just sort of lived a life of luxury. He never had a son. And Marquess of Pombal was very powerful. And he had a great agenda, or a devious agenda, depending on who you ask. He sought to overhaul all aspects of the economic, social, and colonial policy to make Portugal a really efficient contender with other great powers in Europe. Some people say he wanted to secure his own power. He wanted to be this very powerful ruler. And other people say that he was just trying to be, the best leader he could in Portugal and to serve his King Joseph well. And so he got control of public education. He got control of a wealth of church land. And he took Portugal and Lisbon from a sort of pleasant backwater to a very, very formidable power that was dominated. It was dominated by a pretty conservative brand of Catholicism. This is about the time when we talk about the suppression of the Jesuits in the Portuguese Empire. It was a series of political moves rather than any sort of theological controversy. The monarchies that were attempting to sort of centralize and secularize power viewed the Jesuits as being too international, too strongly aligned with the Pope, and too autonomous for the monarchs. And so they kicked out the Jesuits. Again, it's a political thing rather than any sort of religious underpinnings. So Pombal the Pombal was a very, very powerful player, and he was moving and shaking in the city. And with the death of Joseph in February in 1777, sort of jumped to after this disaster, the throne passed to Maria, and she immediately fired him and got him out of the country because she hated him very much for his arrogance and for his violent behavior. So she was just sort of waiting in the wings for her father to die so she could get this guy out of there. So people have different thoughts on the Marquess of Pombal. So to set the stage, it was 1755, All Saints' Day. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes that are eyewitness accounts from this. And you may know, being in a Jesuit school in Catholic theology, the day commemorates those who have attained the beatific vision in heaven. And so it's an international holiday. It's the highest holiday in many Catholic countries. And so 9 a.m., where was everyone? In church, right? Everyone was in these beautiful, ornate Catholic churches. And this man, Reverend Charles Davy, I'll read you a couple of quotes from him. He said, "There was never a finer morning scene than the 1st of November. The sun shone out in its full luster. The whole face of the sky was perfectly serene and clear, and not the least signal of warning of that day, of that approaching event." Side note, it's interesting. We talked in another class about this myth of earthquake weather. Some people say, oh, there's some earthquake weather. It's clear, no wind, and then an earthquake will happen. And you hear this in California. This is a rumor or myth that persists to this day. And it is sort of decided that people just remember a traumatic event, and they're able to remember right before. So people just remember the weather rather than there being any influence at all of meteorologic phenomena on tectonic situations. So we had this beautiful day. It's a high holiday, and everyone's in the churches. The earthquake, estimated magnitude of 8.5 to 9.0. It's really difficult to go into back calculating what size the earthquake was, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it was on par with the Tohoku earthquake, the Japan tsunami that happened. It was 20 times stronger than the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. The epicenter was 200 kilometers, about 120 miles west of Cape St. Vincent. There's the focus of the epicenter. And actually, there seem to be 3 earthquakes, and it's really, really complicated to try to today apply our seismologic techniques and knowledge to what happened back in 1755. And we use different things like looking at the faults the way that they are now, trying to figure out what happened that long ago. And then eyewitness accounts become really important, figuring out what people experienced. And so there seem to be 3 earthquakes. At 9:40 in the morning, 30 of the 40 churches collapsed. It was said the strongest buildings went down first. And then at 10 a.m., most of the rest of the buildings collapsed with the second earthquake. So, 20 minutes apart. And then at noon, there was a third earthquake, which some say is an aftershock. We don't know. Some say there were 3 separate main events, completely leveled Lisbon. And although seismologists have always agreed the epicenter was where this star is, they really debate the tectonics. We don't know what went on. There's different thrust faults out there. There's a dip-slip fault. There are all sorts of complicated things out there. But the area struck was very extensive. The first shock was felt over 1,200,000 miles, and it was felt across Portugal and Spain. It was felt especially in the south. It was felt as far north as Africa. And there are a number of cities all over this region that were considerably affected, though Lisbon was the most affected. And what is this little quote here? Yeah, I want me to do that, okay. So it's really difficult to take these eyewitness accounts and establish exact date, exact time and exact location, but we know that there were 3 things that happened, and they progressively destroyed the city. So here are a couple of other personal accounts. One, this is from the Reverend Charles Davy. It was on the morning of this fatal day, between the hours of 9 and 10, that I was set down in my apartment, just finishing a letter, when the papers and table I was writing on began to tremble with a gentle motion, which rather surprised me, as I could not perceive a breath of wind stirring. Whilst I was reflecting with myself as what I as what this could be, but without having the least apprehension of the real cause. The whole house began to shake from the very foundation, which at first I imputed to the rattling of several coaches in the main street, which usually pass that way. At this time from Bellin to the palace, but on hearkening more attentively, I was soon undeceived, as I found it was owing to a strange, frightful kind of noise underground, resembling the hollow, distant rumbling of thunder. All this passed in less than a minute. I must confess I now began to be alarmed, as it naturally occurred to me that this noise might possibly be the forerunner of an earthquake, as one I remembered, which had happened about 6 or 7 years ago in the island of Madeira, commenced in the same manner, though it did little or no damage. Upon this, I threw down my pen and started upon my feet, remaining a moment in suspense, whether I should stay in the apartment, run into the street, as the danger in both places seemed equal, and still flattering myself that this tremor might produce no other effects than such inconsiderable ones that had been felt at Madeira. But in a moment I was roused from my dream, being instantly stunned with the most horrid crash, as if every edifice in the city had tumbled down at once. The house I was in shook with such violence that the upper stories immediately fell, and through my apartment, which was the first floor, did not then share the same fate, yet everything was thrown out of its place in such a manner that it was with no small difficulty I kept to my feet, expecting nothing less than to be soon crushed to death, as the walls continued rocking to and fro in the frightfulest manner, opening in several places, large stones falling down on every side from the cracks, and the ends of most of the rafters starting out from the roof. I hastened down out of the house, went through the narrow streets where the buildings were either down or were continually falling, and climbed over the ruins of St. Paul's Church to get to the riverside where I thought I might find safety. Here I found a prodigious concourse of people of both sexes in all ranks and conditions, among whom I observed some of the principal canons of the patriarchal church in their purple robes and rochets. All these go in the habit of bishops. Several priests had run from the altars in their sacerdotal vestments in the middle of the celebrating masses, ladies half-dressed, some without shoes, all these whom their mutual dangers here had assembled as a place of safety, were on their knees at prayers, with the terrors of death in their countenance, everyone striking his breast and crying out incessantly, Misericordia, me do. In the midst of our devotions, the second great shock came on and completed the ruin of those buildings which had been already much shattered. The consternation now became so universal that the shrieks and cries of Misericordia could be distinctly heard from the top of St. Catherine's Hill at a considerable distance off, whither a number of people had likewise retreated. At the same time, we could hear the fall of the parish church there, where most people were killed on the spot. So, very, very serious series of 3 events that happened. The city was completely destroyed from this earthquake. So, with a nod to the chair of our department, John Ebel, he wrote a book on how you figure out how to measure earthquakes from back in time. And this is the first earthquake ever to be felt across the globe. There were accounts of it being felt in Norway. There were 6 months of aftershocks. And again, the whole city was destroyed. So we talked about some of these scales before. First intensity scale was the first couple of intensity scales. I won't go into them. We started to figure out how to measure earthquakes in the late 1700s, late 1800s, and then in 1884 we developed the Mercalli scale, which we did spend a lot of time talking about. The Richter scale, which was then switched to moment magnitude scale from 1935 to 1970. So we got better at figuring out the energy release, trying to figure out how big earthquakes are. But this earthquake predates them. So what had to go on is looking at historical earthquakes, again, reading these eyewitness accounts, trying to figure out what happened, and then also looking at these other things. So this is a branch called historical seismology. What seismologists look at when we're trying to figure out how big the earthquake was before any of these scales is looking at altered geologic features, and I told you about some fault blocks, some thrust faults, some sort of faulting off the coast. Also surveys of residents. So we'll talk about a survey that went on that was quite valuable in figuring out how big this earthquake was. If there were any subaqueous landslides, we'll talk about subaqueous landslides in about a month, but looking at megaturbidite deposits. So there's some sort of material that's sitting subaqueously on the side of a slope. We looked at this when we talked about La Palma, right? If there were any turbidites that flowed across a lower area. Any kind of trenching that you can do to see, we talked about trenching when we talked about figuring out earthquake recurrence intervals. Faulted layers of sediment and rock. Remember we said that the stronger the rock is, the less the slip in a tsunami. Or if we didn't, we should have. And the weaker the rock is, the greater the slip. So you can look at the type of rock that's there, look at how big the slip was, and compare it to known earthquakes. So now when we have an earthquake today in Haiti or in any of the other places where we had earthquakes, we know the magnitude, we can look at the slip and the rock type, and then back calculate what it was back in the 1700s. Any sort of liquefied sand, you saw the liquefaction of material in the Tohoku earthquake. So were there any deposits that showed that liquefaction went on over how broad of an area, how much liquefaction went on, and then figure out, again, from that. Landslide debris on land. So we looked at the Lituya Bay tsunami, and we know the magnitude of that. We know what happened there. So we can back calculate from the volume of rock that fell, was there any landslide debris in this area? So it wasn't the case in the Lisbon disaster, but these are other places, other areas of study for different earthquakes. Also abruptly raised or lowered shorelines. And we'll look at some evidence of this. And then, of course, tsunami deposits. You have that wave that comes that takes everything off the shore and then comes again with the second wave. That stuff tends to stay there. So you can figure out how big are the particles, how big are the rocks and the debris that got laid down with this tsunami, and figure out, based on that, how big the earthquake was. But it's as with earthquake prediction, it's really more of an art than it is a science. Trying to figure out a moment magnitude number of energy release from a historical earthquake is quite difficult. But anyway, there were these 3 events that were off the coast of Lisbon. And immediately after the event, a lot of inhabitants had looked for safety. We'll talk about the fire next. They thought that it would be a good thing to do to get on ships, to get out of the harbor, to get out of this destroyed region. The buildings are still falling, rubble's coming down. So they found their way down to the river Tagus, and to the seafront, thinking that would keep them safe from the falling debris. And again, we'll talk about the fire in a minute. Some people just hung out by the side of the river, but other people actually got on to ships. And you know this ominous thought, with the last shock, people were down there and the sea had completely retreated. There were all these sandbars. There were actually shipwrecks and all sorts of debris on the ocean. So people thought, oh, let's go out here and see, we'll be safe, but look at these shipwrecks. Let's see if there's any gold. Let's see if there's anything in these shipwrecks. And so about 30 minutes after the last shock, there were 3 5 to 20 meter high waves, which is up to 70 feet high, that came in. They swept across Spain, they swept across southern Portugal and Morocco, and they devastated the port of Lisbon. They dragged people and debris out to sea. So there were these 3 waves that came with a retreat in between each one. And remember, it's about an hour between the waves, so with each retreat, if other people came down, they didn't know there was going to be another wave between, again, 6 and 70 feet high. So there's the tsunami. And just to remind you, right, the tsunami is short. Tsunami waves are short and wide and very fast moving in the deep water environment. But as it came ashore, and the more quickly you have shallow water, which is Lisbon, you have a very shallow coast, you have a shallow harbor, and you have a flat area, the wave becomes more narrow, slows down, becomes taller, and then crashes into the area. So these people that were drawn to what otherwise would have been a logical location, the banks of the Tagus and the water, because there were no structures to burn or collapse, suddenly had been engulfed by these 3 tsunami waves. And there's another picture of the tsunami wave, obviously not the one from Lisbon, but this big wave that they were standing there hoping that they would be safe from the fire. Sorry, I don't know why this is in here again. So the tsunami, there's another personal account. Let's see if I want to read that whole thing. Yeah, so there's a master vessel that was there, and so Reverend Charles Davy was assured by the captain that there was a that it was safe. And so the boat left, they threw the lead out, and they couldn't find any way to go. Let's see. The two first shocks in time were so violent that several pilots were of the opinion the situation of the sandbar at the mouth of the Tagus was changed, so they thought the whole bathymetry was changed. Certain it is that one vessel at the bar of the mouth, attempting to pass through the usual channel, foundered, and another struck on the sand and was at first given over for lost, but at length got through. There was another great shock after this, which pretty much affected the river, but I think not so violently as the preceding, though several persons assured me that as they were riding on horseback in the great roads leading to Belem, one side which lies open to the river, the waves rushed in with so much rapidity that they were obliged to gallop as far and fast away as possible for fear of being carried away. So there are a couple of other eyewitness accounts that you can read about in your book from this reverend of the tsunami. But this is a very, very shallow region. And so the run-up zone, the zone where the earthquake caused the tsunami, that transition from wide, short, and fast to narrow, tall, and slow, was quite large. And the royal palace was engulfed by waves. Much of the city was engulfed by the waves. The situation, though, was that the city was already in ruins, so the waves were not doing the destroying for the most part. It did extend into some other areas, but the city was so destroyed. Problem here is that there were probably a lot of people who were still alive but were trapped in the debris, and so they think that a lot of people drowned when the waves came in. So you have the earthquake, you have the tsunami, these three waves. And then, as we said before, the vast number of candles that were burning in the churches because it was a high holiday. And then also there were fires in people's homes for cooking and for heat. They started to rage out of control. The city of Lisbon burned for an entire week. It was kept active because, unfortunately, there were strong winds that started to pick up, even though before the earthquake it was pretty non-windy. The wind blew for several days, and it rendered it almost impossible to rescue the people and salvage any goods that were trapped in the ruins. The fire was even more devastating than the earthquake itself. So now you have the earthquake destroying some parts of the city. The fire raged and destroyed really the rest of the city, the opera house, convent, the royal palace, all sorts of libraries, historic buildings. A tremendous number of records were lost, navigational records, historical records, all sorts of treasures, art, etc. was lost. So we'll talk about fire and forest fire later on in the semester, but just to sort of give you an intro to fire and what happens. You have this fire tetrahedron. You need all three of these things, oxygen, heat, and fuel. And you need to have a chain reaction to have the fire sustain. So the oxygen came from the fact that the winds picked up. Suddenly it started to get windy. The fuel was all of the wood, the cooking oil, the fabrics, anything in people's homes and buildings. And then the heat and the chain reaction is because it was above the point of conduction. And it was said this was a heat that knows no boundaries. So it was impossible to tell how many people died in the earthquake versus the tsunami versus drowning from the tsunami water because they were trapped versus burned alive while trapped. So this is a horrid, horrid situation with all of this. The fourth part, because I said it's a quadruple disaster, to add to the terrifying destruction, the sky was for a couple of days completely darkened. And it was completely darkened because there was all this dust and lime from the buildings that came up into the area, mixing with the combustion products of the fire and sulfurous material. So it smelled really sulfurous and bad. People were choking and trapped. So there's a huge cloud of dust and debris that kept Lisbon in a fog for a couple of days. And people were asphyxiated by this fog, this dust storm, essentially. And it's impossible to tell how many people died from that. So there are these four things that happened that did massive, massive destruction to the city and killed lots of people. I'll tell you how many people died in the next slide. But 85% of Lisbon's buildings were destroyed, including these fabulous palaces and libraries. Most examples of Portugal's really distinctive 16th century architecture. And some of the buildings that hadn't been damaged by the earthquake or tsunami were destroyed by the fire. So 85% of the city gone. In terms of how many people died, there weren't the censuses, again, as with the Indian Ocean, Sumatra tsunami, there weren't the censuses or censi that are out today. So it's probably more appropriate to report a range. And these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different sources reporting how many people died. And so what we have here is, the numbers of people who could have passed away. And it's probably more honest or accurate to report a range. And then you have to also think about talking about the death toll in the city versus the region versus global counts. And then also who died from the fire versus the tsunami versus the earthquake versus asphyxiation from the dust inhalation. So some estimates indicated that in Lisbon alone, between 30,000 and 70,000 people died. And but it's impossible to calculate the number of victims again as well. And some of the more trustworthy sources say that it's maybe 10,000, so it could be lower. The latter estimates used in a number of different studies. So this is the number of people globally, this first number of the whole disaster, and then the colon is the number of people that died in the immediate area around Lisbon. So really, really big estimate variation in terms of how many people died. Again, you have to figure out how many people died in Lisbon, how many people died in the whole disaster, how many people died in fire, flood. Sorry, let me go back up. Right. Okay. So the disaster culturally, once the dust settled, was a really powerful setback to this trading nation. Lisbon may have been the richest city in Europe at the time, it was, but it caused an important shift in the balance of the area. The royal family escaped unharmed. The king developed a huge case of claustrophobia, and he went to live by the mountains in a tent. He never again went inside of a building. He had this huge fear of living within walls, so he and his whole family just lived in tents for the rest of their days. And there's a sort of site that is a shrine to them that exists to this day. The Pombal, here's where he started to take over, and some people say that he was an opportunist, other people say that he was a brilliant land use planner and a brilliant emergency disaster responder. The king was beside himself and was a useless, a sniveling sort of mess, just gave up, threw his hands up and just gave up. And so the king said, what do we do? And the Pombal said, bury the dead and heal the living. And he set about with this really, really concerted effort and did an amazing job, many people say, organizing relief and rehabilitation efforts. There were firefighters that were sent to extinguish the flames immediately, teams of workers that were assembled from ordinary citizens that were ordered to remove all the corpses before disease could spread. We'll talk about pandemics and disease in this class as well. So contrary to the custom of the church, which is to bury the dead underground, they took all the corpses and loaded them onto barges and buried them at sea beyond the mouth of the Tagus. They were really worried about the outbreak of disease because of corpses. And they were worried then about looting, right? We've seen things with looting with Hurricane Katrina. So they put up a gallows right in the middle of the city and were hanging people who were looting. So they were trying to, first of all, get rid of the immediate concerns and the fire and disease, and then they were trying to establish order in this totally destroyed city. There were 30 people who were publicly executed because they were stealing. And they also had the army preventing any sort of people from leaving because they wanted the people to stay there and reconstruct and start rebuilding the city. So they barred anyone from leaving the city unless they were very, very ill or injured. So the Pombal appointed 12 district leaders with overarching emergency powers. And he instilled in them the power to and the need to figure out how to feed each district. Where was food going to come from? They got food transported in from the countryside. They encouraged people to go fishing. Taxes on fishing, taxes on any sort of food things were suspended. Ships, again, were not allowed to leave the port unless it was determined that their contents couldn't be useful in the rebuilding of the city or an emergency response. Housing was at a premium, so they started building really, really immediately. But you'll see it's neat. They built immediately, but they built really well. So land rents for buildings and land were controlled so that greedy landowners wouldn't be opportunist and make too much of people. They sorted through the debris. They had teams of people that sorted through the debris to try to salvage materials that we needed in the city for reconstruction. So we had, and again, they kept everyone in the city unless they were very badly injured. The painting here in the upper left corner depicts an angel holding a fiery sword, which is a personification of divine judgment. So again, the social structure was based on this staunch observation in Lisbon of observation of the Catholic religion. Portugal was this very pious city, and a lot of people were thinking that this was the work of an angry God punishing sinners, and it was pointed to that the churches were all ruined as a reason why God was punishing sinners. He caused the churches to fall. But the thing is, so this church, this earthquake not just leveled the city, but it shook the belief in citizens that God was benevolent and that God was there to sort of help them and to foster them along in their life. So there was no salvation. It was really a terrible time. There were these little preachers, street corner preachers that popped up proselytizing about how everyone's going to hell, etc. It's an equally important case study in terms of having evoked a coordinated state emergency response and a comprehensive effort at reconstruction to reduce the events of future disasters and the effects of future disasters. So there was a strong network of aid established between Portugal and many European counterparts. Spain, France, Great Britain, German states, they all sent food, they sent money, they sent building supplies, human expertise, they sent all sorts of things, and medical attention. So they dreaded the outbreak of a plague after all of this stuff that happened, and so they were really, really conscientious about getting rid of all the corpses, and medical people were around to try to save people as much as possible. And it was thought that they did thwart an outbreak of plague or something of that nature because they really got rid of the dead bodies quickly. So with regards to architecture and rebuilding, the king and the prime minister immediately launched efforts to figure out how to rebuild the city. But it was really neat because they did this mix of rebuild the city well and rebuild the city quickly. So there were these models that were made that you can still see in the in some of the museums in this area, and the Pombal with a number of architects built these buildings, model scale buildings, and had the army march around the buildings and saw which structure would stay in the face of shaking. And so of these structures, we have a new one, Pombaline Cage, it's called, which, new in 1755, which persists to this day as one of the great ways to make an earthquake-proof building. It's called Pombaline architecture. It's overlooked by many art historians and architects as being an ugly sort of building, not a beautiful style of building, but it was low and broad, and there was no possibility, virtually no possibility relative to the buildings that were there before, that the building would fall in an average-sized earthquake. Pombaline architecture is also notable because it doesn't have any ornamental decorations, right? And this being 1700s, mid-1700s Europe, there was a lot of really beautiful ornate building going on, and this was thought to be really ugly, but it was super effective at withstanding earthquakes and also fire. So you have these row houses all together, but there would be a huge triple bricked fire break between each building. So if there was a fire in one building, it wouldn't spread to the other buildings. So Pombaline architecture persists to this day. It's a pretty earthquake-proof building type. So rebuilding, again, we saw that the buildings were built to be more flexible so that they would withstand the waves, and the earthquake waves rather. And then this was a really kind of, the new way that was constructed was a prefab city. So there was urban space, there was residential area, there were religious and political areas, there were commercial areas, there were leisure areas. So it was divided. The residential area was also divided according to social hierarchy. So there was the nobility, the bourgeois quarters. So this was a planned city. So they tried to make sure, here's another picture, and there's the Pombal there. They tried to make sure that the city was built in a logical way and was built in a good way. And the Marquis insisted on having very, very big, wide streets. If you've ever been to Lisbon, it's interesting because a lot of the streets in Europe are so small, right? Really, really narrow streets. Lisbon streets are very big, and when they asked him, why are you making these streets so big? The Pombal responded, one day they will be small. So it's interesting. So he thought about the possibility of other earthquakes striking, he thought about fire, and he thought about tsunami, and he made the city so that it would be able to largely withstand any disaster in the future. So he was credited with making Lisbon as great as it is today. Brief note on culture. The earthquake had wide-ranging effects on the lives of the populace and the intelligentsia. So that it struck on an important church holiday did not go unnoticed, and it caused a lot of anxiety and confusion, and there was this sort of fear that was permeating around, and there were books written. So Immanuel Kant, which I have a follow-up to this in the next slide, wrote some things about earthquakes, and then Candide by Voltaire was a book that was written to discuss the earthquake, essentially, and the existential angst that came about as a result of what happened. What is God? How is God helping us? How is God hurting us? Etc. So Kant was a powerful force at the time, as was Voltaire. So Kant proposed that seismic effects can be propagated over very great distances. He also said that there's a cause that triggers the effect, and it's not God. And he said that great seismic events recur over time. He said they come with this periodicity. Notice this. He did, though, miss out on the cause. He tried to figure out what is the cause. His three ideas were that they're due to underground canals and tunnels that ran parallel to mountain chains and the flow of great rivers. So there were these underground tunnels, and there was an explosive mixture of oil that was in these underground tunnels that would it was explosive oil and iron, which is sort of the alchemy of the time, and that there's hot compressed air in these underground caverns, and when this stuff all mixed, there was a huge underground explosion. And so that was his thought as to why earthquakes happen. But the birth of modern seismology, people started thinking this has to be some natural phenomena, and what could it be? Also, with regards to seismology, the measuring of things, the Pombal had a series of questions that he asked people that, again, was very fortuitous that he did this, because we were able to then back calculate what the shaking intensity was, where the focus was, where the damage was. He asked things like, what time of day did the earthquake begin? How long did it last? Did you perceive the shock to be greater from one direction than another? Was it from the north? Was it from the south? Did buildings seem to fall more to one side, to the other? How many people died that you know of, and how did they die? Did the sea rise? Did the sea fall? How many hands did it rise above normal? So he asked this huge list of questions. You see some of them here, and we are able to use this data to tell a lot of things about this earthquake. It was also funny, the sort of birth of tabloid journalism. Newspapers rapidly were developing throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. They were benefiting from an increase in the number of readers that were interested in what's happening all over Europe and other regions of the world that were recently discovered, which had been being incorporated into the so-called known world. So people were hungry for news. And so the newspapers started to be a little bit histrionic about the earthquake, and they wanted to keep the European commercial and cultural markets flowing. So newspapers wrote about the Lisbon disaster for months and months, not only because of its dramatic consequences, but also because of its commercial and its political implications. So to wrap this up, so the paradigm shifts. The earthquake occupied European enlightened minds. There was a search for a scientific explanation. Pombal supported this approach both as a means to calm down a terrified population and also as a statement of his own ideas and his own attitudes. So the Portuguese tried to see this earthquake from an enlightened point of view. This is a real paradigm shift in the thinking of this earthquake. Stimulated a lot of earthquake and seismology research. So if you go there today, there are all sorts of memorials and museums. There are these 4D simulations of the earthquake. You can actually experience it. And there are all sorts of other things that you can see, a mini theater. There's all sorts of neat things that you can go and look at. Neat, it's kind of scary, but Lisbon continues to pay tribute to the Marquis of Pombal by way of a statue that's situated in the middle of the area named Pombal. The statue is, he's sitting on top of the statue on a horse, and he's purposely placed to face downtown towards a portion of Lisbon that most bears his stamp to this day. And so people think this is a fitting tribute to the man that raised Lisbon from the ashes. In terms of today, 2.8 million people and rapidly growing population live in the Lisbon metropolitan region. It's considered the wealthiest region of Portugal. It produces about 45% of the Portuguese gross domestic product of about $100 billion. Tourists add about 50,000 people in the summer, and it's heavily industrialized, especially the south bank of the River Tagus. So it's a sophisticated cultural and financial hub, essentially. It's a mass media sector. There are a lot of companies ranging from television networks to radio stations, etc. And this is a big gap in planning for today. Though we know the 1755 earthquake, the government really isn't prepared for another earthquake and tsunami, and societal disruption and economic loss would be orders of magnitude, obviously greater than previous losses. There's the city. It's situated on this seismic area that's suffered before. We talked about the tectonics. There have been a number of earthquakes around this area, and so seems to be that the future will be that there will be some earthquakes, and maybe one of them would be huge. These are the earthquakes from 2000 to 2005. So you see there are a number of earthquakes in this area, and a couple of big ones. North Algeria, there was a 5.5 and then a 4.9 in 2008. The Strait of Gibraltar, there was a 6.3 in 2010. So who knows the future? Studies continue to show that this is an active plate system. It prompts fears that another earthquake could possibly happen. Subduction still active here. And if there is an earthquake, when there is an earthquake, I don't know. This seismic zone has been storing energy for quite a while. So a seismologist said, imagine picking up the state of Massachusetts, displacing it by 10 meters in 1 minute. That's the type of stress that's accumulating there. So we'll never be able to predict the future, but have a look at Lisbon in the future.